I've always believed that a man's home is his absolute sanctuary, the one place on this green earth where you're supposed to feel the weight of the world drop off your shoulders the second you pull into the driveway. But let me tell you, when you move into a neighborhood governed by a homeowners association run by people with too much time and a God complex, that sanctuary can turn into a battlefield faster than you can say and quote, property values and quote, and honestly, looking back on everything that went down with my wife Sarah and our two boys, Bear and Rogue, I realized that some people don't just want order, they want total, unquestioning submission, and they'll burn your whole life down just to prove they're the ones holding the matches. It started so quietly, just a flicker of annoyance, the kind of thing you brush off because you've got bigger fish to fry, especially for someone like me who spent 12 years in the sandbox overseas dealing with actual life and death stakes. So when we retired to this quiet little suburb in Northern California, all I wanted was peace, a patch of grass, and a place for our retired military working dogs to live out their golden years in the sun. Sarah is a force of nature, a former K9 trainer herself who speaks in quote, dog in quote, better than she speaks in quote, human in quote, sometimes in Bear and Rogue. Well, they aren't just pets, they're 80-pound tactical assets in fur coats, a German Shepherd and a Belgian Malinois who've seen things most people only watch in high-budget action movies. But to us, they're just the boys who like to nap at the foot of the bed and occasionally try to catch the garden hose. The trouble had a name, and that name was Mrs. Gable, the self-appointed queen of the end quote, Willow Creek Estates end quote, HOA, a woman who looked like she spent her mornings measuring the height of her neighbors and oppos, hedges with a laser-guided ruler, and her afternoons seething over the fact that anyone dared to have a personality. The first letter was tucked into our mailbox on a Tuesday. No stamp, just a stark white envelope with that dreaded HOA logo, and inside, Gable had written, not typed, mind you, but written in this aggressive, loopy cursive, that our, in quote, large aggressive breed animals, in quote, were a liability to the community's image and that their, in quote, constant presence, in quote, was driving down the perceived value of the surrounding homes, which was a total joke because Bear and Rogue are probably the most disciplined residents in the whole zip code. They don and oppos. To even bark at the mailman unless they and oppos. Retold to, but Gable didn't and oppos. T care about facts. She cared about control. Sarah laughed it off at first. She really did. She just tossed the letter on the kitchen island and said something about how some people just need a hobby that doesn't involve being a nuisance. But then the letters started coming every other day, each one more unhinged than the last, moving from, in quote, concerns, in quote, to, in quote, directives, in quote, telling us we needed to keep the dogs confined to the indoors at all times or muzzle them whenever they stepped foot on, in quote, common ground, in quote, which apparently included our own front porch in Gable's twisted version of reality. I tried to be the bigger man. I really did. I went to one of those stuffy HOA meetings in a local community center basement, smelling like stale coffee in desperation, and I stood up and calmly explained that these dogs were highly trained, decorated veterans of the U.S. military, and that they posed zero threat to anyone who wasn't into oppos. T currently planting an IED. But Gable just sat there at the head of the table, peering over her glasses with this thin, oily smile, and told me that, in quote, rules don and oppos. T make exceptions for war stories, Mr. Thorne, in quote. And that's when I knew this wasn't oppos. T about the dogs at all. It was about a woman who had realized she couldn't and oppos. T intimidate us. And that was a sin she couldn't and oppos. T forgive. Then things took a turn for the creepy, and I mean real, in quote, tinfoil hat, in quote, territory, because I started noticing this small, black drone hovering over our backyard every afternoon around 4 p.m., right when Sarah would be out there doing some light agility work with the boys, and it would just sit there, its little red camera light blinking like a mocking eye, dipping low enough to make Rogue's ears go flat and his tail go stiff. And one evening, I'd had enough, so I grabbed my high-powered birding binoculars and tracked the damn thing as it buzzed away, watching it land right on the glass-top table of Mrs. Gable's back patio, 3 houses down. I went over there, my heart thumping a heavy rhythm in my chest, and when she opened the door, she didn't in oppos. To even look surprised, she just leaned against the frame and told me she was, in quote, conducting a safety audit and quote, to ensure our fence was up to code. And when I told her that flying a drone over my wife while she's in her leggings in her own backyard felt a lot more like stalking than auditing, she just smirked and said, and quote, if you and Oppos, V, you got nothing to hide, you and Oppos, V, you got nothing to fear, and quote, which is the universal catchphrase for every tyrant in history. The harassment didn't in Oppos. T stop at the property line, though. It started bleeding into our actual lives within quote, compliance officers and quote. Basically just Gable's two retired cronies, Howard and Arthur, who wore matching neon vests like they were on a road crew, marching up our driveway with clipboards and claiming they had reports of, in quote, hazardous odors, in quote, or in quote, excessive noise, end quote, even though the only noise in our cul-de-sac was the sound of their own heavy breathing in one afternoon. They actually tried to tell Sarah that our reinforced cedar fence, which had been approved 2 years ago, was now a, in quote, non-conforming structure, in quote, under some obscure Section 8C that I later found out didn't in Oppos to even exist in the bylaws. They were trying to gasper in us, trying to make the environment so hostile that we just pack up and leave, but they forgot one very important thing. You don't spend a decade in the sandbox without learning how to hold your ground. And Sarah, God bless her, has a spine made of cold-rolled steel, so when Howard tried to lean over her to, in quote, inspect, in quote, the gate latch, she just stepped into his space, looked him dead in the eye, and told him that if he touched that gate without a court order, she'd consider it an act of aggression. And Howard, bless his heart, turned the color of a ripe tomato and scurried back to his golf cart. It all came to a head on a Saturday that started out way too peaceful to stay that way. The kind of morning where the air is crisp and the coffee tastes just right, and Sarah was out in the front yard, kneeling in the dirt, tending to some hydrangeas she'd been working on all spring, while Bear and Roe were sitting perfectly still on the porch, just watching the neighborhood wake up like the professional observers they are. I was inside the garage, working on a mower, when I heard the sound of several car doors slamming, not just one, but three. And when I looked out the window, I saw Gable, Howard, Arthur, and some younger guy I didn't in Oppos. T recognized, a big guy in a tactical-style polo shirt who looked like he'd been hired specifically for his ability to look mean. They weren't in Oppos. T just there to deliver a letter this time. They were lined up at the edge of our lawn like an invading army, and Gable was holding her phone up, clearly recording the whole thing, her face twisted into this mask of triumphant malice. End quote. This is it, Sarah, end quote. Gable shrieked, her voice cracking the morning quiet like a gunshot, end quote. The board has issued an emergency abatement order. Those animals are being seized for public safety, and that fence is coming down today, end quote. Now, anyone with half a brain knows an HOA can and Oppos, T just, end quote, seize, end quote, your property without a mountain of legal paperwork and a sheriff present. But Gable had clearly spent too much time in her own echo chamber and thought she was the law. And when Sarah stood up, brushing the dirt off her knees, her voice was so calm, it was actually scary. She just said, and quote, Mrs. Gable, you are trespassing on private property, and I am asking you once, politely, to leave before this situation escalates, end quote. But Gable just gestured to the big guy in the polo, and that was the moment the world slowed down. The big guy didn't in Oppos. T hesitate. He stepped onto our grass, his eyes fixed on Sarah, and he started barking about how he was, in quote, authorized personnel, in quote, and that he was going to, end quote, secure the area, end quote. And as he moved toward her, his hand went out like he was going to grab her shoulder to spin her around, which was the single biggest mistake of his life. Because Bear and Rogue weren't in Oppos. T, in quote, pets, in quote. In that moment, they were a synchronized defense system that had been triggered by a threat to their primary handler. Bear didn't in Oppos. To even bark, he just launched a blur of black and tan that hit the big guy's chest with the force of a wrecking ball. A, in quote, drive bite, in quote, designed to neutralize and ground target. And the guy went down hard, the air leaving his lungs in a wet wheeze as Bear stood over him, not tearing him to pieces, but pinning him with a low, guttural growl that sounded like a literal chainsaw idling in his throat. At the same time, Howard, who apparently thought he was a hero, grabbed a heavy metal landscape stake from the back of his cart and swung it toward Rogue, but Rogue is a Malinois, and Malinois don in Oppos. T played by the rules of physics. He just ghosted to the left, avoided the swing, and in one fluid motion, latched onto Howard's forearm in A, full mouth, grip, holding him in place with surgical precision. Howard started screaming, "He's eating me! He's eating me!" But the truth was, Rogue hadn't an oppos. T even broken the skin yet. He was just holding him, applying exactly enough pressure to let Howard know that any further movement would be a very, very bad idea. Gable was losing her mind, screaming for someone to, shoot the beasts, her phone shaking in her hand, while Arthur just stood by the cars, his face pale, realizing that they had brought clipboards to a gunfight, metaphorically speaking. Sarah didn't in oppos. T panic, she didn't in oppos. T scream, she just stood there like she was on a training field and said, Rogue hold. Bear, guard, and the dogs froze, becoming living statues of muscle and teeth, keeping the two men pinned to the dirt without a single unnecessary drop of blood being spilled. And that's when I stepped out of the garage, my own phone recording, and I looked at Gable and said, I hope you're getting this on your oppos. Safety audit and oppos, Karen. Because what I'm seeing is a group of 4 people committing criminal trespass and attempted battery on a woman in her own yard. And my dogs? Well, they're just performing a lawful citizen's arrest, The look on Gable's face was worth every cent of the mortgage. It was this mixture of pure, unadulterated shock and a dawning realization that the, simple woman, she thought she could bully was actually the most dangerous person in the neighborhood. And by the time the 3 squad cars pulled up, because you bet your life the neighbors had called 911 the second the screaming started. The scene was so lopsided, it was almost funny. Gable tried to do her, distress victim, routine, clutching her chest, and telling the lead deputy that our, monster dogs, had attacked them for no reason, but the deputy, a guy named Miller who I'd seen around and who actually knew a thing or two about the law, just looked at the big guy on the ground, then looked at Howard's arm, and then looked at the video I was holding out to him. Mind oppos. Miller said, his voice dry as a bone as he watched the footage of the big guy lunging at Sarah first. California Civil Code 3342 is pretty clear about this. A dog owner ISN and oppos. T liable for a bite if the dog is protecting someone from a person committing a crime. And for where I'm standing, your boys here were committing several. He didn't end oppos. T even wait for her to respond before he turned to Howard and the big guy and told them to put their hands behind their backs. And when Gable started screeching about her, HOA authority, Miller just sighed a long, tired sound and said, your bylaws don in oppos. T override the penal code, Mrs. Gable. And right now, you're looking at a charge of conspiracy to commit assault and criminal trespass, And the sound of those handcuffs clicking shut on Gable's wrists was the most beautiful percussion I've ever heard. The aftermath was like a fever dream. The HOA board held an emergency session 2 days later. Without Gable, obviously, since she was busy dealing with her lawyer, and they ended up dissolving the entire current leadership, terrified of the massive civil lawsuit I was politely hinting at in every conversation. And the unconstitutional, fence? Well, it's still there, and now it has a small brass plaque on the gate that says, protected by U.S. Army veterans, And let me tell you, people walk a lot more briskly past our house these days. Bear and Rogue are back to their usual routine, chasing the occasional squirrel and sleeping in the sun, completely unaware that they became local legends. But Sarah and I, we don and oppos. T take the peace for granted anymore, because we learned that some people will always try to clip your wings if they think you and oppos. Reflying too high, but if you got a pack that's got your back, you don't ever have to worry about hitting the ground. But it makes you wonder, doesn't it oppos? T it? We were lucky. We had the training, the dogs, and the presence of mind to film it all. But how many people out there being pushed around by people like Gable every single day? People who don and oppos. T have an 80-pound German Shepherd to stand between them and a bully? It's a thin line between a community and a cage. And I'm curious, have any of you ever had to deal with an HOA or a neighbor who thought they owned the air you breathe? Did you stand your ground? Or did you find it easier to just give in? Because from where I'm sitting, sometimes the only way to deal with a bully is to let them see exactly what happens when they pick the wrong fight. Drop a comment and tell me your stories, because I have a feeling Gable isn't the only one out there who needs a reality check.